It's Wednesday, July 5th. I'm Tre'vell Anderson.
And I'm Priyanka Arabindi, and this is What a Day. On today's show, we're bringing you a conversation about an issue that has been top of mind for us here on What a Day. Just this year, several news outlets across the country have laid off significant amounts of their staff. I'm talking about the Washington Post, the LA Times, Insider, NBC News, and ABC News. The list is truly endless. That's only naming a few.
Absolutely. And it's not just the big mainstream outlets that have been laying off, these important players in the newsroom. We're also seeing this happen in smaller local newsrooms, and that all has an impact on our democracy, on the ability to hold officials accountable, and on encouraging civic engagement. Things that we as journalists and the folks here at Crooked really care about.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really disheartening to see this decline in local news since, as you mentioned, it's a vital resource for people across the country just to know what's going on in their own communities.
Especially as we get ready for another presidential election.
Right.
We need local communities to be getting the necessary information so that they can make the right decision when they go to the polls, for example.
This has only become more and more important as there have become less and less resources, it seems, for these journalists to do their job. So it's really a huge problem.
Yeah, and so I wanted to learn more about the nature of these layoffs and where local news is headed. So I spoke with Mitra Kalita. She's a veteran journalist and newsroom manager, one of my former newsroom managers. She's also co-founder and CEO of URL Media, a multi-platform network of Black and Brown community news outlets that share content and revenue. So she knows a thing or two about the media industry. I started by asking her why newsrooms across the country have been cutting their staff.
2023 has been a pretty awful year for media companies. The first quarter of this year, you have a number of events. You have a lot of those benefits dried up, right? So COVID funding dried up. Federal SNAP benefits, March 1st, the extension of those dry up. And so for those of you who live in neighborhoods where you can judge how well we're doing by your food lines, I'll tell you, here in Queens, the food lines are once again, just as they were immediately after the pandemic, running many times around the block, right? So those are some economic indicators that just give you a sense of the pain. I just right away start to see this behavior of, we got to cancel this advertising contract. If you're a freelancer, maybe you had a deal before and they're calling you and saying, listen, we can't do it. What you started to see were media companies retrench in the short term. That's the short term. There's two games in town, basically, right, for national media. You have the BuzzFeeds of the world. Those were venture-backed outlets. The same for Vice, right? And so basically you had a lot of promise in digital media on the back of, you don't really need to make money right now. You just need to grow your audience. Just grow, right? And so what are the factors over the last 5-10 years of the internet you and I have been a part of to help you gain audience? You look at what's trending on Google News. What are the Twitter moments today? What is Facebook telling you people want to consume content on? And basically, we were able to show a lot of growth of these outlets on the backs of what's trending. The other funding piece that I think you and I have a lot of more familiarity with is the publicly traded media company that's like the LA Times or the Chicago Tribune or Gannett's of the world. Again, all of these models have changed over the last few years, but we're a part of media conglomerates that run a lot of small and local news outlets are basically achieving efficiency at scale. What does that mean? You're covering LA, but your tech folks might be out of Chicago. Then you start to see these layoffs and the discovery that content is actually really expensive, right? That reporting is expensive, that the advertising dollars that we used to use for a print product to come to your home every day, suddenly the LA Timeses of the world and others are in competition with, guess who? BuzzFeed and Vice and Vox Media and other outlets that are free on the internet. When your audience is everybody, your audience is nobody.
Absolutely. And as a result, as you just mentioned, we've seen now a lot of newsrooms, shrinking, many newsrooms disappearing. I've particularly been thinking of this. There was this Medill study from last year that said that 2 local newspapers were shutting down every week in the United States. Obviously, we live in these big cities, right? Your New Yorks, your LAs, your Atlantas of the world, your Chicagos. But if you live in, Dubuque, your local newspaper shutting down will have an outsized impact on your local community. So I wonder if you could speak to a bit how this broader system that is at play as it relates to our news is impacting local communities on a smaller level. I often think about media literacy already being in the shit can, and how if you don't have a newspaper now, to hold your leaders accountable or to tell you, what's going on, how that just deteriorates a society. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think 2 things can be true and they're both connected. One is democracy is crumbling as a result of the scenario you lay out, right? If you don't have news outlets in rural areas or smaller cities, suddenly the watchdog and the accountability on government is non-existent, but also people's participation with civic institutions starts to feel I could just be on my couch. You can read some of the aforementioned outlets and feel outraged and tweet about it and feel like you participated, but you're really not participating in your local government or community or activities, right? That's one area that I think is really fraught in terms of the lack of information then affecting behaviors to participate, right? The second piece, which is also true but connected to what I just said, is people are consuming more information than ever. Notice I use the word information. And so I think one thing we don't talk about enough in the media is we looked at each other as competition. You're at the LA Times, maybe you're looking at KPCC and LAist and the LA Business Journal, the Daily News, those types of outlets are the ecosystem by which media is judging effectiveness. Were we first on this story? Were we competitive on this story? What we've missed over the last few years is just massive consumption across different places, not just Twitter, Facebook, and some of the social media outlets, but, your neighborhood listserv might be where you're getting this information. There's a Reuters report out, and this is really depressing, which also explains, I think, some of the layoffs and the climate that we're in. It asked news consumers around the world, how likely are you to subscribe to a news outlet? Most people not likely, right? What would it take for you to subscribe? And by and large, the answer was nothing, meaning we're disengaged and we don't want to engage. That hurdle, it's not insurmountable, but it requires us to change the very nature of our product in order to survive.
We'll get back to that conversation momentarily, but first, let's pay the bills. We'll be back after some ads.
Want to tell our listeners about a new podcast produced by our friends over at Illuminative, a Native women-led nonprofit organization building power and visibility for Native peoples. It's called American Genocide, and it's about how the U.S. government conspired with the Catholic Church to erase Native communities, the crimes committed by Native American boarding schools, and the generational trauma they left behind. In the podcast, you'll hear from 2 Native Americans, one former journalist and one activist, who travels the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota to chronicle how the dark history of Red Cloud Indian School has caused trauma and division within the Oglala Lakota tribe. This limited series is a gripping true crime story that traces America's attempt to reckon with its past and centers the stories of real Native people and the fallout from the historic abuse of Native children. The first 4 episodes are out now, with just 2 more episodes until the finale on May 24th. New episodes hit every Wednesday. We know Crooked listeners are passionate about uncovering truth, righting historical wrongs, and uplifting marginalized voices. And we think the historical true crime story of American Genocide makes a perfect companion podcast. Be sure to listen and subscribe to the American Genocide podcast. You can find it on iTunes, Spotify, and other streaming platforms. Find out more on their website, illuminative.org.
Support for Pod Save the World comes from Wise, the account that lets you send, spend, and receive money internationally. Wise is the international account built to save you money around the world. 170 countries, 50 currencies, one account. So whether you're taking on Rio or Rome, Miami or Mumbai, you'll always get the mid-market exchange rate when you convert currencies with no markups and no hidden fees. Mids are so hot right now.
Mids are so hot.
You know what I'm saying? With Wise, you can save up to 2x when you send, spend, and receive money, all from one account. Wise helps you save money no matter where you're going next, and Wise Business has everything you need to run and grow your global business. So you can send money, receive payments, and manage your cash flow wherever it flows. No extra legwork, no hassle. Companies like Xero and Google Pay are already managing their money the Wise way. Join 15 million people and businesses who are going global with Wise. Learn how the Wise account could work for you by downloading the app or visiting wise.com/crookedworld. That's wise.com/crookedworld. Support for Pod Save the World comes from Wise, the account that lets you send, spend, and receive money internationally. Wise is the international account built to save you money around the world. 170 countries, 50 currencies, one account. So whether you're taking on Rio or Rome, Miami or Mumbai, you'll always get the mid-market exchange rate when you convert currencies with no markup and no hidden fees. With Wise, you can save up to 2 times when you send, spend, or receive money, all from one account. Wise helps you save money no matter where you're going next. And Wise Business has everything you need to run and grow your global business. So you can send money, receive payments, and manage your cash flow wherever it flows. No extra legwork, no hassle. Companies like Xero and Google Pay are already managing their money the Wise way. Join 15 million people and businesses who are going global with Wise. Learn how the Wise account could work for you by downloading the app or visiting wise.com/crookedworld. That's wise.com/crookedworld.
Now back to my conversation with Mitra Kalita. You recently wrote an op-ed for Time about how the diversity efforts in newsrooms that we particularly saw in 2020 have, disappeared by now in a lot of ways. I think of specifically how a lot of folks of color were hired in various positions in various news outlets as a result of 2020. And now, as we see a lot of these layoffs happening, it's a lot of folks of color, right, who are impacted as a result. Could you talk a bit about that circumstance and what it says about, one, these alleged commitments that these outlets have made, but also kind of this broader issue that we're talking about around how individuals and audiences are interacting with the media at large?
I think the LA Times in your own backyard is a good example of some trends that are happening across the industry. Over the last few years, not only did you have a billionaire buy it, you had the newsroom unionize. You had a big diversity push in the wake of George Floyd that pervaded the entire organization, including at the top of the organization. The editor-in-chief is African-American, Kevin Merida. He's the second Black editor-in-chief of the LA Times. I think that's really significant because you and I both fight not just for the first, but so that there is a second and a third and a so forth, right? What we've just seen with the LA Times and layoffs is a confluence of all of these things. The billionaire owner, how deep is the commitment when times are tough, right? Times are tough right now. The advertising market has shrank. You have a union. The newsroom voted to unionize. What happens when you're unionized? Yes, there are many, many benefits of that. But for the most part, the firing practices to be in compliance with unions, and this has been a trend across digital media, so this is another thing you're seeing, is last in, first out. What does that mean? The last people who got hired are the first who are going to be shed. And what happens when your commitment to diversity is always as recent as, I'm sure you have some Southern phrase, as the wind is blowing, right? It's
Yes.
It's not entrenched in your organization. It's a fad. But across our industry over the last few years, it was where are the people of color, and URL, we run a recruitment arm and we've worked with a number of organizations and we have benefited from that desire to get people of color in the door as fast as possible. But what happens when times are tough? Because many of the other chains that I mentioned were also union shops. And as long as diversity is a fad versus fundamental to the running of these organizations, we are going to shed talent every time there's a downturn. And what is that called? it's systemic racism, right? It is an example of institutions that have not changed themselves to meet the moment, but are kind of doing the cosmetic, perfunctory effort to just have some photos with some people of color on their website. And that, to me, is probably one of the most hurtful parts of 2023, because I believe you cannot disconnect that from the financial failure of these models. You cannot connect the lack of imaginative thinking and the real desire to reinvent yourself with the failure of these institutions, just full stop, right? These organizations are failing. And yet, I would argue that they need diversity and connection to community more than ever for their survival, because that strategy of serving everybody, i.e. the majority of a country being white, has clearly not worked.
That was my conversation with Mitra Kalita, veteran journalist and co-founder of URL Media. One more thing before we go. Are you a trans person living in a red state that has recently passed a ban on gender-affirming care? Have you or someone you love been personally affected by Republican-backed attacks on LGBTQ+ rights? Do you want to make your voice heard right here on this very podcast about the real harm that these laws have on people's lives? We want to hear from you. Send us a voice note or written response at wad@crooked.com with your name, where you're from, and how you've been impacted. If you'd prefer to remain anonymous, that's just fine too. Just let us know. That's all for today. If you like the show, make sure you subscribe, leave a review, read a newspaper, and tell your friends to listen.
And if you're into reading and not just how to keep local news alive like me, What a Day is also a nightly newsletter. Check it out and subscribe at crooked.com/subscribe. I'm Priyanka Arabindi.
I'm Tre'vell Anderson.
And support local journalism. Something we can be excited about.
Yes.
I love that for us.
Absolutely.
An end line we're happy about.
Absolutely. Go subscribe to your local newspaper, please and thanks.
Do it. I mean, my local newspaper published a police blotter every week, and you always got to see who was in trouble for drinking underage. It was really fun. I liked it, personally.
What a Day is a production of Crooked Media. It's recorded and mixed by Bill Lance. Our show's producers, Itzy Quintanilla, Raven Yamamoto, and Natalie Bettendorf are our associate producers. Our intern is Ryan Cochran, and our senior producer is Lita Martinez. Our theme music is by Colin Gilliard and Kashaka.
Meiomi is a big, full-flavored wine, perfect for the moments in life when we're living most fully. Meiomi uses the best that coastal California has to offer, creating Pinot Noir, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, Red Blend, and Meiomi Bright, a lower-alcohol Pinot Noir. Full flavor, fully captivating. Discover Meiomi's unrivaled taste at shopmeiomi.com. That's shop, MEIOMI.com, to find our wines at a store near you. Meiomi, to the fullest. Please enjoy responsibly. Meiomi Wines of Campo, California.